What would you do if the man you loved had chosen to forget you completely, and the only way to honor that love was to remain a stranger? For 26-year-old Margaret Ashford, this was not a theoretical question, but the guiding principle of her entire existence. Every Sunday, without fail, for the past 7 years, she had traveled from her modest cottage in the Lake District to the village of Ravensholm, a place she had no legitimate reason to visit, no family to see, no connection that anyone could understand. She arrived by the earliest coach, walked through the narrow lanes with her head slightly bowed, and positioned herself where she might glimpse, if fortune and timing aligned perfectly, the man who occupied the secret chambers of her heart. The Duke of Ravensholm, Marcus Edward Ashford, a man who had looked at her once, truly looked at her, and then had been forced to look away forever. He did not know she came. He did not know she existed, really, beyond a brief and devastating encounter 7 years prior. To him, she was merely a kind-faced woman who nodded politely from across the village green, who sometimes paused to speak with the village children, who seemed to have a peculiar habit of attending the small stone church, even though she clearly did not live in the parish. What he could not have known was that she came for him, that her entire Sunday was orchestrated around the possibility of seeing him, that she had memorized his schedule, understood his habits, and had shaped her weeks around these few stolen hours of proximity. It was a quiet obsession, born not of madness, but of a love so profound, so impossible, that it could only be honored through absolute secrecy and self-denial. Settle in, and let us journey back to 7 years prior, to the moment when Margaret's life had been irrevocably altered by a single meeting, a single choice, and a love that could never be spoken aloud. 7 years earlier. Margaret had been a governess in the household of Lord and Lady Whitmore, a minor but respectable family whose country estate bordered the Duke's vast holdings. She had held the position for 3 years, a stable, quiet life, devoted to the education of 2 clever children and the maintenance of careful, professional distance from the emotional chaos that seemed to swirl around every household staff. She was not beautiful in the manner that turned heads in ballrooms. She was small, dark-haired, with eyes that held more thoughtfulness than vivacity, but she possessed something that was, in its own way, more compelling, an ability to see people clearly, to understand what lay beneath their carefully maintained facades, to offer a quiet kindness that made others feel, in her presence, that they were known. It was this quality that had first drawn the Duke's attention. He had come to the Whitmores' estate on a spring afternoon, riding with Lord Whitmore to view a property dispute regarding a boundary fence. The 2 men had been closeted in the study for most of the day, and by late afternoon they had emerged with a resolution and a thirst that led them to the parlor, where Lady Whitmore was hosting tea. Margaret had been with the children, reading to them in the schoolroom, a task she could easily have delegated to the nurse. But she preferred these hours, preferred the simplicity of stories and the direct gratitude of young minds. She had not known there were visitors. When she emerged into the hallway to collect the children for their supper, she nearly collided with the Duke. He was a tall man. That was her first impression. Tall, and carrying himself with the particular weight that came with absolute certainty of one's place in the world. His hair was dark, his features strong and austere, but it was his eyes that struck her most forcefully, a pale grey blue, the color of winter water, and in them a terrible weariness that spoke of burdens too heavy to be properly borne. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Margaret said quickly, stepping aside. The Duke did not move immediately. He regarded her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "You are the children's governess," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace. They are well educated, I understand. Lady Whitmore speaks of them with pride." "I do my best, Your Grace," Margaret replied, unsure why the Duke of Ravensholm would concern himself with the education of Lord Whitmore's children. "You must be an exceptional governess," he said quietly. "There is something in your manner that suggests considerable patience and clarity of purpose. Those are rare qualities." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you, Your Grace. I take pride in my work." The Duke continued to regard her, and in that moment she felt truly seen, not as a servant, not as a woman of no particular account, but as a person of substance and value. "What is your name?" he asked. "Margaret Ashford, Your Grace." Something flickered across his face at that, a recognition perhaps, or a moment of profound connection. He reached out, very slowly, and took her hand. The gesture was improper, entirely without precedent, and yet it felt inevitable, as if something larger than social convention had determined that they must touch. "Marcus," he said quietly, "my name is Marcus. I wonder if, in another life, another circumstance, we might have had the opportunity to know one another properly." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She understood, in that moment, what he was acknowledging, a recognition of something between them that was rare and precious and utterly impossible. "Your Grace," she said softly, "we must not." "I know," he said, releasing her hand with visible reluctance. "Believe me, I know. I merely wished for you to know that I recognized you, that I saw you. That will have to be enough." He turned and walked back toward the study, leaving Margaret standing in the hallway, with her heart beating so violently she thought it might break through her ribs. 3 days later, she learned that the Duke had made an advantageous marriage. It was announced in the papers. The Duke of Ravensholm had become engaged to the daughter of an earl, a young woman of considerable beauty and impeccable lineage. The wedding would take place in 2 months. Margaret had wept, though she had forced herself to do so only in the privacy of her small room, late at night, when no one would hear. She had wept for something that had never been, something that could never be, something that had lasted only the space of a single conversation in a hallway. But she did not regret it, because in that moment she had been truly known, and that knowledge, that recognition, had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The present day. 7 years had passed since that afternoon. The Duke had married, as planned. His wife had borne him 2 children. Margaret knew this from the village gossip, from the announcements in the papers, from the glimpses she had caught during her Sunday visits. The Duchess was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable accomplishment and impeccable manners. She was said to manage the Duke's estates with intelligence and devotion. Margaret had no reason to hate her. The Duchess had done nothing wrong. She had simply been born into a position that Margaret could never occupy, and had the good sense to marry a man who was, by all reports, a devoted husband and an admired leader. And so Margaret had made a decision that had seemed, at the time, to be the only possible choice. She would keep her love alive by keeping it hidden. She would honor what had passed between them by ensuring that it remained pure and untouched by the messiness of reality. She had left her position as a governess. She had used the small legacy left to her by a distant aunt to purchase a modest cottage in the Lake District, some 20 miles from Ravensholm. It was far enough to require a deliberate journey, close enough that such a journey was feasible. And every Sunday, with the regularity of prayer, she made that journey. She would arrive on the early coach, she would walk through the village, sometimes stopping to speak with the vicar, sometimes pausing to admire the way the morning light fell on the old stone church. She would position herself where she might see the Duke, sometimes in the village square where he occasionally conducted business, sometimes at the church where he attended services, sometimes in the meadows on the edge of his estate where he rode in the afternoon. And when he appeared, she would smile. Not a smile of recognition or familiarity. Nothing that would have aroused suspicion or concern. Simply a brief, genuine smile, the acknowledgement of one human being to another. A smile that said, "I see you, I know you are here, I honor your presence in the world." And then she would turn away and wait for the evening coach that would carry her back to her cottage. By all external measures, Margaret's life was quiet, orderly, and devoid of incident. She had developed a reputation in her village as a kind woman of modest means, one who was fond of the outdoors and inclined toward solitude. She took long walks, she read extensively, she had become friendly with the village librarian and the schoolmaster. She was, to all appearances, content. But the truth was more complex. Every moment of her week was organized around those Sunday hours in Ravensholm. Every choice she made was filtered through the question, would this compromise her ability to make the journey? Would this damage her reputation in a way that might make her Sunday visits suspicious or scandalous? It was a kind of devotion, she supposed, and like all forms of devotion, it required sacrifice. She had declined the respectful proposals of two worthy men who might have made her comfortable life into a joyful one. She had turned away from opportunities to travel, to establish new connections, to build a future that extended beyond the parameters she had established. She had, in essence, made herself a ghost in the life of the man she loved, present enough to honor their connection, invisible enough that she could never compromise him. On this particular Sunday, 7 years after their meeting, Margaret made her journey, as always. The early coach deposited her in Ravensholm at 9:30. The spring morning was fine, with soft clouds and the promise of warmth to come. She walked through the village with her usual deliberation, pausing to admire a window box bursting with primroses, speaking briefly with the baker's wife, who had come to recognize her by sight. The Duke attended services at the church every Sunday, without fail. Margaret had arranged her schedule so that she would arrive at the church just as the service was concluding, allowing her to see him as he emerged into the afternoon light. She took a position near the lych gate, arranging her skirts with the careful precision of someone who had time and space to occupy without appearing to be lying in wait. And then, as she had known it would, the church door opened and the Duke emerged. He was with his family, the Duchess, elegant in pale blue, 2 children, a boy of perhaps 5 and a girl of 3, both with their father's dark hair. The Duchess was speaking to the vicar, thanking him for his sermon. The children were being shepherded by a nurse. The Duke stood slightly apart, his gaze surveying the churchyard with that same expression of weariness that Margaret remembered from 7 years past. He looked older. There was more grey at his temples, deeper lines around his eyes. But there was also something else, a remoteness, as if a part of him had withdrawn from the world and had never fully returned. Margaret felt, in that moment, a rush of pity, so intense it nearly stopped her breathing. Without thought, without calculation, she smiled. Not her usual measured smile, something deeper, more genuine. A smile that came from a place of true compassion, true understanding of the burden he carried. The Duke's gaze caught hers. For a moment, just a moment, recognition flickered in those pale grey eyes. Not recognition of her as a specific person, but a kind of acknowledgement of the smile itself, and of the woman who was offering it. Then the Duchess called his name, and he turned away. But Margaret saw something shift in his shoulders, some small easing of tension, and she knew that he had felt, for just an instant, that he was known, that someone saw the weariness beneath the title, the man beneath the position, the heart beneath the careful facade. It was not enough. It could never be enough. But it was what she had to offer, and she would offer it faithfully, for as long as it was possible to do so. 6 months later. The Duchess was expecting a child. Margaret learned this from the village gossip, from the careful announcements in the newspapers, from the way the Duke's household seemed to shift into a state of cautious preparation. A third child was cause for some concern. The Duchess was no longer young, and pregnancies at her age carried risks. But there was also an undercurrent of joy in the household, an expectation of continuation and legacy. Margaret felt the news like a blow, not because she begrudged the Duke his happiness. She had made her peace with his marriage long ago, but because it served as a reminder of all that lay between them, all that could never be bridged. That Sunday, she almost did not go to Ravensholm. For the first time in 7 years, she remained in her cottage, curled in a chair, with a book she could not concentrate on, wrestling with the question of whether it was time to stop, time to release herself from this vigil, time to accept that some loves are meant to exist only in the realm of imagination and quiet longing, never in the world of action and presence. But by evening, she knew she could not stop, not while breath remained in her body and strength in her limbs, because the smile was not really about the Duke at all. It was about honoring the moment when she had been truly known, truly seen, and as long as she could offer that smile to the world, could carry that recognition forward, she was, in a sense, fulfilling a sacred obligation. So she made the journey again the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. The Duchess's pregnancy progressed. Margaret observed the changes in the Duke's household from afar, the careful way he supported his wife, the consideration evident in his bearing. She felt, oddly, a gratitude toward him for his kindness. Whatever the Duchess might lack, and Margaret was not arrogant enough to imagine she knew what that was, the Duke was, at least, a good man, a conscientious husband. That was something. In September, news came that the Duchess had been safely delivered of a son, a healthy child. The Duke was said to be overjoyed. Margaret attended the church service the following Sunday, as always. She arrived to find the entire village gathered, come to celebrate the news of the new heir. The church was decorated with flowers. The bells rang with particular enthusiasm. The Duke emerged with his entire family. The Duchess, looking pale but pleased, the older children, and in a nurse's arms, a small infant wrapped in white lace. Margaret positioned herself where she could see them clearly. She waited for that moment when the Duke would lift his gaze, when he might notice her, when she might offer her smile. But this time, as he stepped into the churchyard, the infant turned its head. The baby was small, with the Duke's dark hair, and in that moment, the child's eyes, grey, pale, the exact colour of the Duke's, opened and regarded the world with the particular intensity of a newborn encountering light for the first time. The Duke reached down to touch his son's face, and in that gesture, Margaret saw everything: the weight of legacy and responsibility, the profound love he felt for this child, the way a man's life could be defined not by the secret moments, but by the daily, visible acts of devotion. She understood then, with a clarity that was almost painful, that her own devotion, hidden, secret, entirely one-sided, was, in the end, a kind of illusion. Real love, she saw, was not about being known, it was about knowing. It was not about recognition received, but recognition given. It was about seeing the other person fully, completely, and honoring what you saw by allowing them to grow beyond you. The Duke looked up, and his gaze passed over her face. This time, Margaret did not smile. Instead, she inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement, and in some indefinable way, of release. A gesture that said, "I have loved you well. Now I release you to your life, to your family, to the future that belongs to you and not to me." The Duke blinked, as if something in her expression had caught him off guard. For a moment, his brow furrowed in confusion, as if he were trying to place her, to understand why she seemed significant. Then the Duchess called his name, and he turned away, attending to his wife, and Margaret knew that he would never quite remember the brief conversation in the hallway 7 years ago, that it would remain, in his memory, a fleeting moment, barely more than a dream, and that this was, perhaps, exactly as it should be. 1 year later. Margaret stopped making the journey to Ravensholm. It was not a sudden decision, but a gradual realization. The Sundays began to feel different. The cottage began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a home. She developed friendships in her village that were not tied to her emotional architecture. She began to write poems and essays exploring themes of love, loss, and the quiet heroism of letting go. One afternoon, the schoolmaster, a kind man named Robert, who had been showing particular interest in her company, invited her to walk with him to the nearby lake. Margaret accepted. As they walked, she felt something unfamiliar, a lightness of spirit, an openness to the possibility of the future that did not have to be calculated around her secret devotion. "I have been wanting to ask you something," Robert said, as they stood looking out over the water. "I wonder if you might allow me to call on you more formally. I do not know if you have felt the same connection that I have felt, but I would like very much to know you better." Margaret looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw a good man, a kind man, a man who was present and real and able to be known in a way that the Duke could never be. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I would like that very much." 5 years later. Margaret, now Margaret Whitmore, no relation to her former employers, as fate would have it, stood in the garden of her newly purchased house, a modest but charming place on the outskirts of her village. Her husband was away on business, but he would return by week's end, and then they would be celebrating the news that had only recently been confirmed. They were to have a child. She had been happy. It had surprised her, this happiness. She had not expected to feel such uncomplicated joy after so many years of quiet suffering. She was tending to her roses when a visitor arrived. At first, she did not recognize him. A gentleman on horseback, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. But as he dismounted, something in his face became familiar, and Margaret's breath caught. It was the Duke, older than she had seen him last, more lined, but unmistakably the same man. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked, approaching her carefully, as if uncertain of his welcome. "Your Grace," Margaret replied, her heart beginning to beat with an intensity that surprised her. "I was not expecting. What brings you to this part of the country?" "I have been traveling," the Duke said. "I was in the area on business, and I found myself taking a route past your house. He paused, and Margaret saw something in his face that she had not seen before, a kind of desperate uncertainty. "I must apologize if this is inappropriate, but for many years I have been troubled by a sense of having known you. I have seen you in my village numerous times, and there is something in your face that speaks to me of connection, of a moment that I have struggled to remember." Margaret felt tears begin to form, though she could not quite understand why. "Your Grace, please," he interrupted, "allow me to finish. I do not know if what I am about to say will make sense, but I have come to believe that there was a moment, years ago, when we met, a moment that was significant, and I wonder if you might help me to understand what it was." Margaret looked at him, at this man she had devoted 7 years of her life to loving from a distance, at this man she had watched with her heart breaking and then mending, at this man who represented everything that might have been and could never be. "Yes," she said quietly, "there was such a moment." The Duke looked relieved, as if a question that had haunted him for years was finally being answered. "Will you tell me?" he asked. And so, Margaret told him. She told him of that afternoon in the hallway, of the recognition that had passed between them, of how she had felt truly known in a way that few people ever experience. She did not tell him of the 7 years of Sunday journeys, of the secret smile, of the way her entire life had been organized around glimpsing him from a distance. Some truths, she had learned, were not meant to be spoken aloud. "I have thought of you often," the Duke said, when she had finished. "Wondered if what I experienced was real or merely a fancy. I even spoke to my wife about it, years ago, how I had felt that I was known, truly known, by a stranger. She told me that such moments occur in life, and that they are significant, but that we must be grateful for them, and then release them into the past, where they belong." "Your wife is a wise woman," Margaret said. "She is," the Duke agreed. He looked around at the garden, at the modest but well-tended house, at the visible evidence of a life built on contentment and simple joy. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret said, and she meant it. "Yes, I am happy." The Duke smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face and made him, for just a moment, look like the man she had loved so desperately all those years ago. "Then I am grateful," he said. "I have carried that moment between us for so long, wondering what it meant, troubled by the sense that something significant had occurred that I could not quite grasp. Now I understand. It was the moment when 2 people recognized each other's essential selves, and I was meant to carry that knowledge forward, and you were meant to release it and move into your own life." "Yes," Margaret whispered. "Yes, exactly that." The Duke stayed for another hour. They talked of inconsequential things, the weather, the village gossip, the changes in the countryside over the years. They did not speak again of that moment in the hallway, or of the 7 years that had followed. When he left, he took her hand, just as he had all those years ago, and held it for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for allowing me to finally understand." Margaret watched him ride away, disappearing down the lane as the afternoon light turned golden, and she felt, in that moment, a sense of completion that she had not experienced even in the happiness of her marriage. She had loved him She had honored that love through the only means available to her, and now he knew that he had been loved and known and honored, and in that knowing, the secret devotion was transformed from something hidden and sad into something sacred and redemptive. What we hold most secretly in our hearts often reveals itself when we learn to release it with grace. That evening, Margaret sat at her desk and began to write. Not poetry this time, but a letter that she would never send, but that she would keep, should she ever doubt the reality of what had occurred. Dear Marcus, you asked me once if, in another life and circumstance, we might have known one another properly. I have spent many years pondering that question, and I have come to understand that we did know one another, fully and completely, in that single moment in the hallway. I have learned that love is not always about being united with the object of one's devotion. Sometimes love is about honoring what has been recognized and then releasing it so that both people might live the lives they are meant to live. I came to your village every Sunday for 7 years. I stood in the shadows and smiled at you from across the green. I never meant for you to know, but I wanted you to feel, even if you could not consciously understand why, that you were seen and honored and loved. Now, having found my own happiness, I release you fully into the past. I thank you for the gift you gave me, the knowledge that I was, once, truly known. That gift has sustained me through loneliness and guided me toward joy. May you live long and happily, and may you always know that somewhere in the world there is a woman whose heart recognizes your essential self. With gratitude and blessing, Margaret. She placed the letter in an envelope and sealed it. She would keep it, locked away, a testament to a love that had been real and significant even in its secrecy and impossibility. And on Sunday mornings, instead of making the long journey to Ravensholm, Margaret would walk with her husband, or tend to her garden, or simply sit with a cup of tea and allow herself to feel the peculiar happiness of a woman who had loved greatly and had learned, at last, how to let go. Thank you for journeying with Margaret through the quiet heroism of loving from a distance, and the grace that comes when we learn to honor our deepest feelings by allowing others to be free. If Margaret's story touched your heart, please leave a like and tell us in the comments what you believe she gained from her 7 years of devoted secrecy. Be sure to subscribe for more stories of love in its most unexpected forms and the profound transformations that occur when we learn to release what we cherish most. We'll see you next time.